Today's target SA330. The auditor's responses to assessed risk. Scope of this essay: the standard essay deals with auditor's responsibility relating to design and implement responses to the risk of material misstatement identified and assessed by the auditor in accordance with SA330. Risk of material misstatement identified and assessed by the auditor in accordance with SA315, identifying and assessing risk of material misstatement through understanding entity and its environment in a financial statement audit. Objective of the auditor is to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence about the assessed risk of misstatement through designing and implementing appropriate responses, assessed risk and appropriate responses to those risks. Definitions. For the purpose of essay, the following terms have the meaning attributed below. Substantive procedure. Substantive procedure and audit procedure. An audit procedure designed to detect material misstatement. To detect material misstatement at the assertion level, substantive procedures comprise test of detail. Substantive procedures comprise test of detail and substantive analytical procedures. Test of controls. An audit procedure designed to evaluate the operating effectiveness of controls in preventing, detecting and corresponding material misstatement at the assertion level. Operating effectiveness of controls in preventing, detecting and correcting. Requirement. Overall responses. The auditor shall design and implement overall responses to address the assessed risk of material misstatement at the financial statement level. The auditor shall design and implement overall response. The overall responses shall be design and implement overall responses to address the assessed risk. To address the assessed risks of material misstatement at the financial statement level. Audit procedures responsive to the assessed risk of material misstatement at the assertion level. The auditor shall design and perform. Auditor shall design and perform further audit procedures whose auditor shall design and perform further audit procedures whose nature, timing or extent are based on and are responsive to the assessed risk. Responsive to the assessed risks of material misstatement at the assertion level. In designing the further audit procedures to be performed, the auditor shall consider the reasons for the assessment given. Consider the reasons for the assessment given to the risk of material misstatement at the assertion level for each class of transactions, account balances and disclosures, including the likelihood of material misstatement due to the particular characteristic of the relevant class of transactions, whether the risk assessment takes into account the relevant controls, that is the control risk, thereby requiring the auditor to obtain audit evidence to determine whether the controls are operating effectively. That is, the auditor intends to rely on the operating effectiveness of controls. In determining the nature, timing or extent of substantive procedures. Obtain more persuasive audit evidence the higher the auditor's assessment of risk. Obtain more persuasive audit evidence the higher the auditor's assessment of risk. Test of controls. The auditor shall design and perform test of controls to obtain the auditor shall design and perform test of controls to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence as to the operating effectiveness of relevant controls when the auditor's assessment of risk of material misstatement when the auditor's assessment of RMM at the assertion level includes an expectation that the controls are operating effectively. The expectation that the controls are operating effectively, that is, the auditor intends to rely on the operating effectiveness of controls. That is, the auditor intends to rely on the operating effectiveness of controls in determining the nature, timing, and extent of substantive procedures, or substantive procedures alone cannot provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence at the assertion level. Substantive procedures cannot provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence at the assertion level. In designing and performing tests of controls, the auditor shall obtain more persuasive audit evidence the greater the reliance the auditor places on effectiveness of a control. In designing and performing test of controls, the auditor shall obtain more persuasive audit evidence the greater the reliance the auditor places on the effectiveness of a control. The greater the reliance the auditor places on effectiveness of a control. Nature and extent of test of controls. In designing and performing tests of controls, the auditor shall perform other audit procedures. In combining with inquiry to obtain audit evidence about the operating effectiveness of the controls, including how the controls were applied at relevant times during the period under audit. Nature and extent of test of controls. In designing and performing test of controls, the auditor shall perform other audit procedures in combination with inquiry to obtain audit evidence about the operating effectiveness of the controls, including how the controls were applied at relevant times during the period under audit, the consistency with which they were applied, by whom or by what means they were applied, the consistency with which they were applied. In designing and performing tests of control, the auditor shall perform other audit procedures. The auditor shall perform other audit procedures in combination with inquiry to obtain audit evidence about the operating effectiveness. In combination with inquiry to obtain audit evidence about the operating effectiveness of the controls, including how the controls were applied at relevant times during the period under audit, the consistency with which they were applied, how the controls were applied at relevant times during the period under audit, the consistency with which they were applied, By whom or by what means they were applied. By whom or by what means they were applied. Determine whether the controls to be tested depends upon other controls, indirect controls, and if so, whether it is necessary to obtain audit evidence supporting the effective operation of those direct controls. Obtaining the effectiveness of the controls, including how the controls were applied at relevant times during the period under audit. The consistency with which they were applied, by whom or by what means they were applied. Determine whether the controls to be tested depend upon the other controls. Determine whether the controls to be tested depends upon other controls, indirect controls, and if so, whether it is necessary to obtain audit evidence supporting the effective operation of those indirect controls. Timing of tests of controls. The auditor shall test controls for the particular time or throughout the period. For a particular time or throughout the period for which the auditor intends to rely on those controls, subject to para 12 and 15 below, in order to provide an appropriate basis for the auditor's intended reliance using audit evidence obtained during an interim period. When the auditor obtains audit evidence about the operating effectiveness, of controls during an interim period, the auditor shall obtain audit evidence about significant changes. Audit evidence about the operating effectiveness of controls during interim period, the auditor shall obtain audit evidence about significant changes to those controls subsequent to the interim period. Determine the additional audit evidence to be obtained for remaining period. Using audit evidence obtained in previous audits and determining whether it is appropriate to use audit evidence about the operating effectiveness of the controls obtained in the previous audit, and if so, the length of the time period that may elapse before retesting a control. The auditor shall consider time period that may elapse before retesting a control, the effectiveness of other elements of internal control, including control environment, the entity's monitoring of control, and the entity's risk assessment procedure. The risk arising from characteristics of control, including whether it is manual or automated. The effectiveness of general IT controls. The effectiveness of the control and its application by the entity, including the nature and extent of deviations in the application of the control. The effectiveness of the control and its application by the entity, including the nature and extent of deviations in the application of the control noted in previous audits, and whether there have been personal changes that significantly affect the application of the control. Personal changes that significantly affect the application of the control, whether the lack of a change in a particular control possesses a risk due to changing circumstances, whether the lack of a change in a particular control possesses a risk due to changing circumstances, and the risk of material misstatement and the extent of reliance on the control. The risk of material misstatement and the extent of reliance on the control. 14. If the auditor plans to use audit evidence from a previous audit about the operating effectiveness of specific controls, the auditor shall establish the continuing relevance of the of that evidence by obtaining audit evidence about whether significant changes in those controls have occurred subsequent to the previous audit. The auditor shall obtain this evidence by performing inquiry combined with observation or inspection to confirm the understanding of those specific controls, and if there have been changes that affect the continuing relevance of the audit evidence from the previous audit, the auditor shall test the controls in the current audit. If there have not been such changes, the auditor shall test the controls at least once in every third audit, and shall test some controls each audit to avoid the possibility of testing all the controls on which the auditor intends to rely in a single audit period, with no testing of controls in the subsequent two audit periods. At least once in every third audit, or the auditor shall test the controls and shall test some controls each audit to avoid the possibility of testing all the controls on which the auditor intends to rely in a single audit period, with no testing of controls in the subsequent two audit periods. Control over significant risk. When the auditor plans to rely on controls over a risk the auditor has determined to be significant risk, the auditor shall test those controls in the current period. When the auditor plans to rely on controls over a risk the auditor has determined to be a significant risk, the auditor shall test those controls in the current period. Evaluating the operating effectiveness of controls. When evaluating the operating effectiveness of relevant controls, the auditor shall evaluate whether misstatements that have been detected by substantive procedures indicate that controls are not operating effectively. When evaluating the operating effectiveness of relevant controls, the auditor shall evaluate whether misstatements that have been detected by substantive procedures indicate that controls are not operating effectively. The absence of misstatements detected, the absence of misstatements detected by substantive procedures, however, does not provide audit evidence that controls related to the assertion being tested are effective. When deviations from controls upon which the auditor intends to rely are detected, the auditor shall make specific inquiries to understand these matters and their potential consequences, and shall determine whether the tests of controls have been performed, provide an appropriate basis for reliance on the controls. Additional tests of controls are necessary. The potential risk of misstatement need to be addressed using substantive procedures. Tests of controls that have been performed to provide an appropriate basis. Additional tests of controls. Potential risks of misstatements addressed using substantive procedures. What are substantive procedures? Irrespective of the assessed risk of material misstatement, the auditor shall design and perform substantive procedures for each material class of transactions, account balances, and disclosures. The auditor shall consider whether external confirmation procedures are to be performed as substantive audit procedures. Substantive procedures related to the financial statement closing process. The auditor's substantive procedure shall include the following audit procedures related to the financial statement closing process. Financial statement closing process. Agreeing or reconciling the financial statements with the underlying accounting records, examining material journal entries and other adjustments made during the course of preparing the financial statements. Agreeing or reconciling, examining material journal entries. Substantive procedures responsive to significant risk. When the auditor has determined that an assessed risk of material misstatement at the assertion level is a significant risk, the auditor shall perform substantive procedures that are specifically responsive to that risk. When the approach to a significant risk consists only of substantive procedures, those procedures shall include test of details. Auditor has determined assessed risk of material misstatement at assertion level is a significant risk. Shall perform substantive procedures which are specifically responsible to that risk. When the approach to a significant risk consists only of substantive procedures, these procedures shall include test of detail. Timing of substantive procedures. When substantive procedures are performed at an interim date, the auditor shall cover the remaining period by performing substantive procedures combined with test of controls for intervening period. Substantive procedures plus test of control. B. If the auditor determines that it is sufficient, further substantive procedures only. Further substantive procedures that provide a reasonable basis for extending the audit conclusions from the interim date to the period end. If misstatements that the auditor did not expect when assessing the risk of material misstatement are detected at the interim date, the auditor shall evaluate whether the related assessment of risk and the planned nature, timing, or extent of substantive procedures covering the remaining period need to be modified. Auditor did not expect risk of material misstatements are detected at an interim date. Then the planned nature, timing, extent of substantive procedures shall be modified. Adequacy of presentation and disclosure. The auditor shall perform audit procedures to evaluate whether the overall presentation of the financial statements, including the related disclosures, is in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework. Evaluating the sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence. Based on the audit procedures performed and the audit evidence obtained, the auditor shall evaluate before the conclusion of the audit whether the assessment of the risk of material misstatement at the assertion level remain appropriate. Whether the assessment of the risk of material misstatement at assertion level remain appropriate. The auditor shall evaluate before conclusion of the audit. The auditor shall conclude whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained. In forming an opinion, the auditor shall consider all relevant audit evidence, regardless of whether it appears to be corroborate or to contradict the assertions in the financial statements. The auditor shall consider audit evidence regardless whether it appears to corroborate or to contradict assertion in the financial statement. 27. If the auditor has not obtained sufficient appropriate audit evidence as to a material financial statement, the auditor shall attempt to obtain further audit evidence. If the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, the auditor shall express a qualified opinion or disclaimer of opinion. If auditor is unable to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, he shall give a disclaimer of opinion or qualified opinion. Documentation. The auditor shall document the overall responses. To address the assessed risk of material misstatement at the financial statement level and the nature, timing, and extent of the further audit procedures performed. The linkage of those procedures with the assessed risk at the assertion level. The result of the audit procedures, including the conclusions where these are not otherwise clear. First was the auditor shall document overall responses to address the assessed risk of material misstatement at the financial statement level, linkage of those procedures with assessed risk at assertion level, result of audit procedures, including the conclusions where these are not otherwise clear. Para 29. If the auditor plans to use audit evidence about the operating effectiveness of controls obtained in the previous audit, the auditor shall document the conclusions reached about relying on such controls that were tested in a previous audit. Document the conclusions about relying on such controls that were tested in a previous audit. 30. The auditor's documentation shall demonstrate that the financial statements agree or reconcile. The auditor's documentation shall demonstrate that financial statements agree or reconcile with the underlying accounting records. Application and other explanatory material. Overall responses to address the assessed risk of material misstatement at the financial statement level may include emphasis to the audit team the need to maintain professional skepticism. Emphasis to the audit team the need to maintain professional skepticism, assigning more experienced staff or those with special skills or using experts. Assigning more experienced staff, providing more supervision, incorporating additional elements of unpredictability in the selection of further audit procedures to be performed, making general changes to the nature, timing, or extent of audit procedures. For example, performing substantive procedures to the period end instead at an interim date, or modifying the nature of audit procedures to obtain more persuasive audit evidence. Overall responses assessed risks involve at financial statement level involve emphasis to audit team to maintain professional skepticism, assigning more experienced staff, supervision, additional element of unpredictability for selection of further audit procedure, general changes to nature, timing, extent for persuasive audit evidence to obtain more persuasive audit evidence. A2. The assessment of the risk of material misstatement at the financial statement level and thereby the auditor's overall responses is affected by the auditor's understanding of the control environment. An effective control environment may allow the auditor to have more confidence in internal control and the reliability of audit evidence generated internally within the entity, and thus, for example, allow the auditor to conduct some audit procedures at an interim date rather than at the period end. Deficiencies in the control environment, however, have the opposite effect. For example, the auditor may respond to an ineffective control environment. The auditor may respond to an ineffective control environment by conducting more audit procedures as of the period end rather than at an interim date. Conducting more audit procedures as of the period end rather than at an interim date. Obtaining more extensive audit evidence from substantive procedures. Increasing the number of locations to be included in the audit scope. Conducting more audit procedures as of the period end rather than at an interim date. Such considerations, therefore, have a significant bearing on the auditor's general approach. For example, an emphasis on substantive approach, or an approach that uses test of control as well as substantive procedures. Combined approach. Audit procedures responsive to the assessed risk of material misstatement at the assertion level, the nature, timing, extent of FAP, further audit procedures. The auditor's assessment of the identified risk at the assertion level provides a basis for considering the appropriate audit approach for designing and performing further audit procedures. For example, as appropriate and notwithstanding the requirements of this standard on auditing, the auditor may determine that only by performing test of control may the auditor achieve an effective response to the assessed risk of material misstatement for a particular assertion. Performing only substantive procedures is appropriate for particular assertions, and therefore the auditor excludes the effect of controls from the relevant risk assessment. This may be because the auditor's risk assessment procedures have not identified any effective controls relevant to the assertion, or because testing controls would be inefficient, and therefore the auditor does not intend to rely on the operating effectiveness of controls in determining the nature, timing, and extent of substantive procedures. Performing only substantive procedures is appropriate for particular assertions. The auditor excludes effect of controls from relevant risk assessment because auditors' risk assessment procedure have not identified any effective controls relevant to the assertion, or because testing controls would be inefficient, and therefore the auditor does not intend to rely on the operating effectiveness of controls in determining the nature, timing, and extent of substantive procedures. A combined approach using both test of controls and substantive procedures is an effective approach. A combined approach using both test of controls and substantive procedures is an effective approach. The nature of an audit procedures refers to its purpose, that is, tests of controls or substantive procedures, and its type, that is, inspection, observation, inquiry, confirmation, recalculation, reperformance, or analytical procedures. Inspection, observation, inquiry, confirmation, reperformance, analytical procedure. The nature of the audit procedures is of most importance in responding to the assessed risk. Nature of the audit procedures is of most importance in responding to the assessed risk. The timing of an audit procedures refers to when it is performed, or the period or date to which the audit evidence applies. Extent of an audit procedure refers to the quantity to be performed. For example, a sample size or the number of observations of a control activity. Designing and performing further audit procedures. Designing and performing further audit procedures whose nature, timing, extent are based on para A8. Designing and performing further audit procedures whose nature, timing, extent are based on and are responsive to the assessed risk of material misstatement at the assertion level provides a clear linkage between the auditor's further audit procedures and the risk assessment. Responding to the assessed risk at the assertion level. Nature. The auditor's assessed risk may affect both the types of audit procedures to be performed and their combination. Affects both the types of audit procedures to be performed and combination. For example, when an assessed risk is high, the auditor may confirm the completeness of the terms of a contract with the counterparty. In addition to inspecting the documents, further certain audit procedures may be more appropriate for some assertions than others. For example, in relation to revenue, test of controls may be most appropriate, most responsive to the assessed risk of misstatement of the completeness assertion, whereas substantive procedures may be most responsive to the assessed risk of misstatement of the occurrence assertion. A10. The reason for the assessment given to a risk are relevant in determining the nature of audit procedures. For examples, if an assessed risk is lower because of the particular characteristics of a class of transactions without consideration of the related controls, then the auditor may determine that substantive analytical procedures alone provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence. The auditor may determine that the substantive analytical procedures alone provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence. On the other hand, if the assessed risk is lower because of internal controls, and the auditor intends to base the substantial procedures on that low assessment, then the auditor performs tests of those controls as required by para 8a. This may be the case, for example, for a class of transactions of reasonably uniform non-complex characteristics that are routinely processed and controlled by the entity's information system. Timing. The auditor may perform test of controls or substantive procedures at an interim date or at the period end. The higher the risk of material misstatement, the more likely it is that the auditor may decide it is more effective to perform substantive procedures nearer to or at the period end rather than at an earlier date, to perform audit procedures unannounced or at an unpredictable times. For example, performing audit procedures at selected locations on an unannounced basis. This is particularly relevant when considering the response to the risk of fraud. For example, the auditor may conclude that when the risk of intentional misstatement or manipulation have been identified, audit procedures to extend audit conclusions from interim date to the period end would not be effective. On the other hand, performing audit procedures before the period end may assist the auditor in identifying significant matters at an early stage of the audit and consequently resolving them with the assistance of management or developing an effective audit approach to address such matters. In addition, certain audit procedures can be performed only at or after the period end. For example, agreeing the financial statements to the accounting records. In addition, certain audit procedures can be performed only at or after the period end. For example, agreeing the financial statements to the accounting records. Agreeing the financial statements to the accounting records, examining the adjustments made during the course of preparing the financial statement, and procedures to respond to a risk that at the period end the entity may have entered into improper sales contract or transactions may not have been finalized. Further relevant factors that influence the auditor's consideration. Of when to perform audit procedures include the following: the control environment. When relevant information is available, for example, electronic files may subsequently be overwritten, or procedures to be observed may occur only at a certain times. The nature of the risk, for example, if there is a risk of inflated revenue to meet earning expectations by subsequent certain date, relevant factors the auditor's consideration when to perform audit procedures, control environment, when relevant information is available, nature of the risk, period or date to which the audit evidence relates, extent. The extent of audit procedure judge the extent of an audit procedure judged necessary is determined after considering the materiality, the assessed risk, the degree of assurance the auditor plans to obtain. When a single purpose is met by a combination of procedures, the extent of each procedure is considered separately. In general, the extent of audit procedure increases. The extent of audit procedure increases as the risk of material misstatement increases. For example, in response to the assessed risk of material misstatement due to fraud, increasing sample sizes or performing substantive analytical procedures at a more detailed level may be appropriate. However, increasing the extent of an audit procedure is effective only if the audit procedure itself is relevant in the specific risk. However, increasing the extent of an audit procedure is effective. Increasing the extent of an audit procedure is effective only if the audit procedure itself is relevant to the specific risk. Para A16. The use of computer assisted audit techniques CATs may enable more extensive testing of electronic transactions and account files, which may be useful when the auditor decides to modify the extent of testing. For example, in responding to the risks of material misstatement due to fraud, such techniques can be used to select sample transactions from key electronic files, to sort transactions with specific characteristics, or to test an entire population instead of a sample. To sort transactions with specific characteristics, or to test an entire population instead of a sample. In certain circumstances, the audit mandate and any other special auditing requirements may affect the auditor consideration of the nature, timing, and extent of further audit procedures. Considerations specific to smaller entities. In the case of a very small entities, there may not be many control activities that could be identified by the auditor, or the extent to which their existence or operation have been documented by the entity may be limited. In such cases, it may be more efficient for the auditor to perform further audit procedures that are primarily substantive procedures. In some rare cases, however, the absence of control activities or of other components of control may make it impossible to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Higher assessment of risk. When obtaining more persuasive audit evidence because of higher assessment of risk, the auditor may increase the quantity of evidence or obtain evidence that is more relevant or reliable. Example, by placing more emphasis on obtaining third party evidence or by obtaining corroborative evidence from a number of independent sources. Test of control. Designing and performing test of controls. Test of controls. Designing and performing test of controls. Test of controls are performed only on those controls that the auditor has determined are suitably designed to prevent or detect and correct. And correct to prevent or detect or correct a material misstatement in an assertion. If substantially different controls were used at different times during the period under audit, each is considered separately. Testing the operating effectiveness of controls. Testing the operating effectiveness of controls is different from obtaining an understanding and evaluating the design and implementation of controls. However, the same type of audit procedures are used. The auditor may therefore decide it is efficient to test the operating effectiveness of controls at the same time as evaluating their design and determining that they have been implemented. Further, although some risk assessment procedures may not have been specifically designed as tests of control, they may nevertheless provide audit evidence about the operating effectiveness of the controls and consequently serve as test of controls. For example, the auditor's risk assessment procedures may have included inquiring about management's use of budgets, observing management's comparison of monthly budgets and actual expenses, observing management's comparison, inspecting reports pertaining to the investigation of variances between budgeted and actual amounts. These audit procedures provide knowledge about the design of the entity's budgeting policies and whether they have been implemented, but may also provide audit evidence about the effectiveness of the operations of budgeting policies in preventing or detecting material misstatement in the classification of expenses. In addition, the auditor may design a test of controls to be performed concurrently with the test of details on the same transaction. Although the purpose of a test of control is different from the purpose of a test of detail, both may be accomplished concurrently by performing a test of controls and a test of details on the same transactions, also known as dual purpose test. For example, the auditor may design and evaluate the results of a test to examine an invoice to determine whether it has been approved and to provide substantive audit evidence of a transaction. A dual purpose test is designed and evaluated by considering each purpose of the test separately. In some cases, as discussed in SA315, the auditor may find it impossible to design effective substantive audit procedures that by themselves provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence at the assertion level. Auditor find it impossible to design effective substantive procedures that by themselves provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence at the assertion level. This may occur when an entity conducts its business using information technology and no documentation of transaction is produced or maintained other than through the IT system. In such cases, Para 8b requires auditor to perform tests of relevant controls. Where whole entity is managed through information technology. Audit evidence and intended reliance. A higher level of assurance may be sought about the operating effectiveness of controls when the approach adopted consists primarily of tests of controls In particular, where it is not possible or practicable, to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence only from substantive procedures. Nature and extent of test of controls. Other audit procedures in combination with inquiry. Inquiry alone is not sufficient to test the operating effectiveness of controls. Accordingly, other audit procedures also are required to be performed in combination with inquiry. In this regard, inquiry combined with inspection or reperformance may provide more assurance than inquiry and observation, since an observation is pertinent only at the point in time at which it is made. The nature of the particular control influences the type of procedure required to obtain audit evidence. Types of procedures required to obtain audit evidence about whether the control was operating effectively. For example, if operating effectiveness is evidenced by documentation, the auditor may decide to inspect it to obtain audit evidence about operating effectiveness. For other controls, however, documentation may not be available or relevant. For example, documentation of operation may not exist for some factors in the control environment, such as assignment of authority and responsibility, or for some type of control activities, such as control activities performed by a computer. In such circumstances, audit evidence about operating effectiveness may be obtained through inquiry in combination with other audit procedures such as observation or the use of computer assisted audit techniques. Extent of test of controls. When more persuasive audit evidence is needed regarding the effectiveness of a control, it may be appropriate to increase the extent of testing of the control as well as the degree of reliance on controls. Matters the auditor may consider in determining the extent of tests of controls include frequency of the performance of control by the entity during the period, length of time during the audit period that the auditor is relying on the operating effectiveness of the control, expected rate of deviation from a control, relevance and reliability of the audit evidence to be obtained regarding the operating effectiveness of control at the assertion level. The extent to which audit evidence is obtained from tests of other controls related to the assertion. SA330 audit sampling contains further guidance on the extent of testing. Para A29. Because of the inherent consistency of information technology processing, it may not be necessary to increase the extent of Because of inherent consistency of information technology processing, it may not be necessary to increase the extent of testing of an automated control. An automated control can be expected to function consistently unless the program, including the tables, files, or other permanent data used by the program, is changed. Once the auditor determines that an automated control is functioning as intended, which could be done at the time the control is initially implemented, or at some other date, the auditor may consider performing tests. To determine that the control continues to function effectively. Control continues to function effectively. Such test might include determining that changes to the program are not made without being subject to appropriate program change controls. Changes to the program are not made without being subject to the appropriate change controls. The authorized version of the program is used for processing transaction. Other relevant general controls are effective. Such tests also might include determining that changes to the programs have not been made, as may be the case when the entity uses packaged software applications. When the entity uses packaged software applications without modifying or maintaining them. For example, the auditor may inspect the record of the administration of IT security to obtain audit evidence that unauthorized access has not occurred during the period. Testing of indirect controls. Testing of indirect controls. In some circumstances, it may be necessary to obtain audit evidence. In some circumstances, it may be necessary to obtain audit evidence supporting the effective operation of indirect controls. For example, when the auditor decides to test the effectiveness of a user review of exception reports detailing sales in excess of authorized credit limits, the user review and the related follow-up in the control that is directly of relevance to the auditor controls over the accuracy of the information in the reports. For example, the general IT controls as described as indirect controls. General IT controls. Information in the reports are controls over the accuracy of the information. Controls over the accuracy of the information in the reports are described as indirect controls. Because of the inherent consistency of information technology processing, audit evidence about the implementation of an automated application control, when considered in combination with audit evidence about the operating effectiveness of the entity's general controls, in particular change controls, may also provide substantial audit evidence about its operating effectiveness. Timing of test of controls. Intended period of reliance. Audit evidence pertaining only to a point in time may be sufficient for the auditor's purpose. For example, when testing controls over the entity's physical inventory counting at the period end. If, on the other hand, the auditor intends to rely on a control over a period, tests that are capable of providing audit evidence that the controls operated effectively at relevant times during that period are appropriate. Such tests may include tests of the entity's monitoring of controls. Using audit evidence obtained during an interim period. Relevant factors in determining what additional audit evidence to obtain about controls that were operating during the period remaining after an interim period include relevant factors in determining what additional audit evidence to obtain about controls that were operating during the period remaining after an interim period include the significance of the assessed risk of material misstatement at the assertion level. The significance of the assessed risk of material misstatement at an assertion level. The specific controls that were tested during the interim period and significant changes to them since they were tested, including changes in the information system, processes, and personnel. The degree to which audit evidence about the operating effectiveness of those controls were obtained. The degree to which audit evidence about the operating effectiveness of those controls were obtained, the length of the remaining period, the extent to which auditor intends to reduce further substantive procedures based on the reliance of controls. The extent to which the auditor intends to reduce further substantive procedures based on the reliance of controls. The control environment. Additional audit evidence may be obtained, for example, by extending tests of controls over the remaining period or testing the entity's monitoring of controls. Using audit evidence obtained in previous audits. In certain circumstances, audit evidence obtained from previous audits may provide audit evidence where the auditor performs audit procedures to establish its continuing reliance. In certain circumstances, audit evidence obtained from the previous audits may provide audit evidence where the auditor performs audit procedures to establish its continuing reliance. For example, in performing a previous audit, the auditor may have determined that an automated control was functioning as intended. The auditor may obtain audit evidence to determine whether changes to the automated control have been made that affect its continued effective functioning through, for example, inquiries of management and the inspection of logs to indicate what controls have been changed. Consideration of audit evidence about these changes may support either increasing or decreasing. Consideration of audit evidence about these changes may support either increasing or decreasing the expected audit evidence to be obtained in the current period about the operating effectiveness of the controls. Controls that have been changed from previous audit. Changes may affect the relevance of the audit evidence. Changes may affect the relevance of audit evidence obtained in previous audits such that there may no longer be a basis for continued reliance. For example, changes in a system that enable an entity to receive a new report. Changes in a system that enable an entity to receive a new report from the system probably do not affect the relevance of audit evidence from a previous audit. However, a change that causes data to be accumulated or calculated differently does affect it. Controls that have not changed from previous audit. Controls that have not changed. The auditor's decision on whether to rely on audit evidence obtained in previous audits for controls that have not changed since they were last tested and are not controls that mitigate a significant risk is a matter of professional judgment. In addition, the length of time between retesting such controls is also a matter of professional judgment, but is required by para 14b to be at least once in every third year. Not changed since they were last tested, not controls mitigate significant risk, length of time at least once in every third year. In general, the higher the risk of material misstatement or greater the reliance on controls, the shorter time period elapsed, if any, is likely to be. The time period elapsed, if any, is likely to be shorter. Factors that may decrease the period for retesting a control or result in not relying on audit evidence obtained in previous audit at all include the following: a deficient control environment, deficient monitoring of controls, significant manual element to the relevant controls, personal changes that significantly affect the application of control, changing circumstances that indicate the need for changes in the control, deficient general IT controls, when there are number of controls for which the auditor intends to rely on audit evidence obtained in previous audits, testing some of those controls in each audit provides corroborative information about the continuing effectiveness of the control environment. This contributes to the auditor's decision about whether it is appropriate to rely on audit evidence obtained in previous audits, evaluating the operating effectiveness of controls, evaluating the operating effectiveness of controls. A material misstatement detected by the auditor's procedures is a strong indicator of the existence of a significant deficiency in internal control. The concept of effectiveness of the operations of controls recognize that some deviations in the way controls are applied by the entity may occur. Deviations from prescribed controls may be caused by such factors as changes in key personnel, significant seasonal fluctuations in volume of transactions, and human error. The detected rate of deviation, in particular in comparison with expected rate, the detected rate of deviation, in particular in comparison with the expected rate, may indicate that the control cannot be relied on to reduce risk. Control cannot be relied on to reduce risk at the assertion level to that assessed by the auditor. Substantive procedures. Para 18 requires the auditor to design and perform substantive procedures for each material class of transaction, account balances, and disclosure irrespective of the assessed risk of material misstatement. The requirement reflects that the fact the auditor assessment of risk is judgmental. Auditor's assessment of risk is judgmental and so may not identify all risk of misstatement, and there are inherent limitations to internal control, including management override. Nature and extent of substantive procedures. Nature and extent of substantive procedures. Depending on the circumstances, the auditor may determine. The auditor may determine that performing only substantive analytical procedures will be sufficient to reduce audit risk to an acceptably low level. For example, where the auditor's assessment of risk is supported by audit evidence from tests of control, only test of details are appropriate. A combination of substantive analytical procedures and test of details are most responsive to the assessed risk. Substantive analytical procedures. Substantive analytical procedures are generally more applicable to large volume of transactions. Substantive analytical procedures are generally more applicable to large volume of transactions that tend to be predictable over time. SA330 Analytical Procedures establishes requirements and provides guidance on the application of analytical procedures during an audit. Establishes requirements and provides guidance on the application of analytical procedures during an audit. The nature of the risk and assertion is relevant. The nature of the risk and assertion is relevant to the design of tests of details. For example, tests of details related to the existence or occurrence assertion may involve selecting from items contained in a financial statement amount and obtaining the relevant audit evidence. On the other hand, test of details related to the completeness assertion may involve selecting from items that are expected to be included in the relevant financial statement amount and investing whether they are included. Because of the assessment of risk of material misstatement takes account of internal control, the extent of substantive procedures may need to be increased. Because the assessment of the risk of material misstatement takes account of internal control, the extent of substantive procedures need to be increased when the results from test of controls are unsatisfactory However, increasing the extent of an audit procedure is appropriate. However, increasing the extent of an audit procedure is appropriate only if the audit procedure itself is relevant to the specific risk. In designing test of details, the extent of testing is ordinarily thought of in terms of the sample size. However, other matters are also relevant, including whether it is more effective to use other selective means of testing, SA500 audit evidence. Considering whether external confirmation procedures are to be performed. External confirmation procedures frequently are relevant. When addressing assertions associated with account balances and their elements. External confirmations, but need not be restricted to these items. For example, the auditor may request external confirmation of the terms of agreements, contracts, or transactions between an entity and other parties. External confirmation procedures also may be performed to obtain audit evidence about the absence of certain conditions. For example, a request may specifically seek confirmation that no side agreement exists that may be relevant to an entity's revenue cutoff assertion. Other situations where external confirmation procedures may provide relevant audit evidence in responding to assessed risks of material misstatements include bank balances and other information relevant to banking relationships. Relevant to banking relationships, accounts receivable balances and terms, inventories held by third party at bonded warehouse for processing or on consignment, property title deeds held by lawyers or financiers for safe custody or as a security, investments held for safekeeping by third parties or purchased from stockbrokers but not delivered at the balance sheet date, amount due to lenders, including relevant terms of repayment and restrictive covenants. Accounts payable balances and terms. Accounts payable. Although external confirmation may provide relevant audit evidence relating to certain assertions, there are some assertions for which external confirmation provide less relevant audit evidence. For example, external confirmations provide less relevant audit evidence relating to the recoverability of accounts receivable balances than they do of their existence. The auditor may determine that external confirmation procedures performed for one purpose provide an opportunity to obtain audit evidence about other matters. For example, confirmation requests for bank balances often include requests for information relevant to other financial statement assertions. Such considerations may influence the auditor's decision about whether to perform external confirmation procedures. Factors that may assist the auditor in determining whether external confirmation procedures are to be performed as substantive audit procedures include the confirming party's knowledge of the subject matter. Responses may be more reliable if provided by a person at the confirming party who has the requisite knowledge about the information being confirmed. The ability or willingness of the intended confirming party to respond. For example, the confirming party may not accept responsibility, may consider responding, may have concerns about potential legal liability, may account for transactions in different currencies, or may operate in an environment where responding to confirmation request is not a significant aspect of day-to-day operations. In such situations, confirming parties may not respond, may respond in a casual manner, or may attempt to restrict the reliance placed on the response. The objectivity of the intended confirming party, if the confirming party is a related party of the entity, responses to the confirmation request may be less reliable when the intended confirming party is a related party. Substantive procedures related to the financial statement closing process. Substantive procedures related to financial statements closing process. The nature and also the extent of the auditor's examination of journal entries and other adjustments depends on the nature and complexity of the entity's financial reporting process and the related risk of material misstatement. Substantive procedures responsive to significant risks. Para 21 of this standard requires the auditor to perform substantive procedures that are specifically responsive to risks the auditor has determined to be significant risk. Audit evidence in the form of external confirmations received directly by the auditor from appropriate confirming parties may assist the auditor in obtaining audit evidence with the high level of reliability that the auditor requires to respond to significant risk of material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. For example, if the auditor identifies that management is under pressure to meet earning expectations, there may be a risk that management is inflating sales by improperly recognizing revenue related to sales agreements with terms that preclude revenue recognition, or by invoicing sales before shipment. In these circumstances, the auditor may, for revenue recognition, for example, design external confirmation procedures not only to confirm outstanding amounts but also to confirm the details of the sales agreements, including date, any right of return, and delivery terms. In addition, the auditor may find it effective to supplement such external confirmation procedures with inquiries of non-financial personnel in the entity regarding any changes in sales agreements and delivery terms. Timing of substantive procedures referred to in para 22 to 23. In most cases, audit evidence from a previous audit substantive procedures provide little or no audit evidence for the current period. There are, however, expectations. Example, a legal opinion obtained in a previous audit related to the structure of a securitization to which no changes have occurred may be relevant in the current period. In such cases, it may be appropriate to use audit evidence from a previous audit substantive procedures if that evidence and the related subject matter have not fundamentally changed and audit procedures have been performed during the current period to establish its continuing relevance. Using audit evidence obtained during an interim period. Using audit evidence obtained during an interim period. Using audit evidence obtained during an interim period. In some circumstances, the auditor may determine that it is effective to perform substantive procedures at an interim date and to compare and reconcile information concerning the balance at the period end with the comparable information at the interim date to identify amounts that appear unusual, to identify amounts that appear unusual, investigate any such amounts, and perform substantive analytical procedures or test of detail to test the intervening period. A56. Performing substantive procedures at an interim date without undertaking additional procedures at a later date increases the risk that the auditor will not detect misstatements that may exist at a period end. The risk increases as the remaining period is lengthened. Factors such as the following may influence whether to perform substantive procedures at an interim date: the control environment and the other relevant controls, availability at a later date of information necessary for the auditor's procedures, the purpose of the substantive procedures, assessed risk of material misstatement, nature of the classes of transactions or account balances and related assertions and disclosures, the ability of the auditor to perform appropriate substantive procedures or substantive procedures combined with tests of controls to cover the remaining period in order to reduce the risk that misstatements that may exist at the period end will not be detected. Factors such as the following such as the following, may influence whether to perform substantive analytical procedures with respect to the period between the interim date and the period end. Whether the period end balances of the particular classes of transactions or account balances are reasonably predictable with respect to amount, relative significance, and composition. Whether the entity's procedures for analyzing and adjusting such classes of transactions or account balances at interim dates and for establishing proper accounting cutoffs are appropriate. Whether the information system relevant to the financial reporting will provide information concerning the balances at the period end and the transactions in the remaining period that is sufficient to permit investigation of significant unusual transactions or entries including those at or near the period end. Other causes of significant fluctuations or expected fluctuations that did not occur, and the changes in the composition of the classes of transactions or account balances. Misstatements detected at an interim date. When the auditor concludes that the planned nature, timing, or extent of substantive procedures covering the remaining period need to be modified as a result of unexpected misstatements detected at an interim date, such modification may include extending or repeating the procedures performed at the interim date at the period end. Adequacy of presentation and disclosure. Adequacy of presentation and disclosure. Evaluating the overall presentation of the financial statements, including the related disclosures. Evaluating the overall presentation of the financial statements, including related disclosures, relates to whether the individual financial statements are presented in a manner that reflects the appropriate classification and description of financial information and the form, arrangement, and content of the financial statement and their appended notes. Evaluating the sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence. Evaluating the sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence. An audit of financial statement is a cumulative and iterative process. As the auditor performs planned audit procedures, the audit evidence obtained may cause the auditor to modify nature, timing, or extent of other planned audit procedures. Information may come to the auditor's attention that differs significantly from the information on which the risk assessment was based. For example, the extent of misstatements that the auditor detects by performing substantive procedures may alter the auditor's judgment about the risk assessments and may indicate a significant deficiency in the internal control. The auditor may become aware of discrepancies in accounting records or conflicting or missing evidence. Analytical procedures performed at the overall review stage of the audit may indicate a previously unrecognized risk of material misstatement. In such circumstances, the auditor may need to re-evaluate the planned audit procedures based on the revised considerations of assessed risk for all or some of the classes of transactions, account balances, and disclosures, and related assertions. SA315 contains further guidance on revising the auditor's risk assessment. The auditor cannot assume that an instance of fraud or error is an isolated occurrence. Therefore, the consideration of how the detection of a misstatement affects the assessed risk of material misstatement is important in determining whether the assessment remains appropriate. The auditor's assessment as to what constitutes sufficient appropriate audit evidence is influenced by the auditor's judgment as to what constitutes sufficient appropriate audit evidence is influenced by factors such as significance of the potential misstatement in the assertion and likelihood of its having a material effect individually or aggregated with other potential misstatements of the financial statements. Effectiveness of management's responses and controls to address the risk, experience gained during previous audits with respect to similar potential misstatements, results of audit procedures performed, including whether such audit procedures identified specific instances of fraud or error, source and reliability of available information, persuasiveness of the audit evidence, understanding of the entity and its environment, including the entity's internal control. Documentation. The form and extent of the audit documentation is a matter of professional judgment and is influenced by nature, timing, extent, and complexity of the entity and its internal control. Availability of information from the entity, and the audit methodology and technology used in the audit. Material modifications to ISA 330 auditors responses to assessed risk. Finished. Next is SA330, that is audit consideration relating to an entity using a service organization.